Good morning, everybody. I hear something. Can everybody hear me?
I can hear you.
All right. Thank you. Well, we're getting ready, getting about time for another exam. We're going to finish chapter 26 today, the financial system. And then we're going to have the homework due a week from today. And by the way, chapter 25, productivity, is due tonight. Hopefully that has already been done, so you've been focusing on the financial system. And then I was thinking an exam Tuesday, November 3rd, on just chapters since we've covered the last exam. So that'd be 23 and 24, that's GDP and Consumer Price Index. Chapter 25, productivity, and chapter 26, financial system. Then it'd be the same as last time, I guess. Give you 2 or 3 hours and just do it whenever you want that day. Let's see, what else we got going here?
Hey, Mr. Ford.
Sure.
Hey, I just joined. What were you just saying about chapter 26?
Chapter 26, that's the financial system. We're going to wrap that up today. And the homework for that will be due next Thursday. And then the following Tuesday, November 3rd, and I'll write this all up in a course announcement, we'll have our second exam, and it'll cover just the stuff we've covered since the last exam. That'd be chapter 23, 24, 25, and the current chapter 26. And I guess that's what I said. So again, I'll put that on.
I'm glad I asked.
What?
I had just said that I was glad that I asked.
Oh,
that was pretty important.
Sure, but I will put that in a course announcement too. When I send out the recording of the link to the recording of this, I will put all that in there as well. So, okay, well, any questions about anything? Anything? Not very many. A few of you send me questions in Blackboard messages, but not a whole lot. Feel free to ask, to speak. Before we wrap up the last part of chapter 26, I'd like to finish our little movie about Sweden. Sweden's a really interesting case study because they were back in the mid 1800s. They were one of the
talk to, but that's like right before.
Pardon? Okay, someone's mic was on, I guess. In the mid 1800s, they were one of the poorest countries in the world, literally. Poorer than the Congo. I mean, they were extremely impoverished. And then they began to implement the ideas of Anders Chydenius. That's the philosopher or the economist, if you will. He kind of preceded the great economists we know of today. Usually begins with Adam Smith in Scotland in 1776. But he had a lot of the same ideas, and they finally began to implement them around the mid-1800s with free markets, minimum government regulation or intervention, personal freedom, property rights, all the things we talked about that government can do to create an environment under which productivity can flourish. And the results were amazing. They became one of the richest countries in the world. And between 1850 and 1950, their GDP increased 7 times. And then, this is about where we left off, around the 1960s, 70s, 80s, there began to be a push for a welfare state, and which required very high taxes. And those very high taxes stifled innovation and productivity. And they took a nosedive. And then later they reformed again to implement the same system they had before, and then now are currently one of the richest countries in the world. Anyway, let's pick it up where we left off, and we will then go from there. Let's see. Okay, can you see my screen? Anybody out there? Someone say yay or nay.
I can see it.
Yep.
See it?
You can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Here we go.
From 1976 to 1995, Sweden's economic growth shriveled to nearly 50% of the growth of other developed nations. Countries like France, Germany, Australia, and the US. Our economy was in crisis. Inflation had reached 10%. And for a brief period, interest rates soared to 500%.
I remember that there were some major family companies that moved abroad. Ingvar Kamprad, the IKEA founder, he went to Switzerland.
Är utomordentligt besvärande i Sverige eftersom ju Ikeas aktier representerar en stor förmögenhet, så skulle det åderlåta Ikea allt för mycket.
Jag tror att mycket av våra problem i Sverige beror just på att man straffar de som vill satsa helt och hållet på sin företagskarriär.
It seems like what Sweden did in the 1970s and the 1980s, that seems to be the image that has stuck for some reason among Americans. Why is that?
American society at that time was undergoing such dramatic conflict and upheaval, the Vietnam War and the civil rights struggle. So it looked like somehow the anti-America was the utopia that wasn't America. Sweden moved on. Institutions were tried out. Some turned out not to be very successful and were abandoned. But the perception has been pretty much frozen for lots of Americans in that late 60s and 1970s model. But it doesn't correspond to what Sweden is today.
By the 1990s, the economy was in turmoil and had reached a breaking point. Sweden decisively changed course. Reforms were voted in. The wage earner fund was abolished and taxes reduced. The pension system, healthcare, and education were all reformed, and the utilities deregulated. But many people had grown accustomed to their abundant benefits, regardless of the country's ability to pay for them.
Initially, these reforms were very unpopular among the population, and two governments fell because of these reforms and the crisis. But in retrospect, I think just about everybody agrees that they had to be done. They had to be pushed through. And they united between the different parties, so there was agreements across party lines.
Remember how our economic growth crumbled to 50% of developed countries back in the 1970s and 80s? Well, since the reforms of the 1990s, our growth rate has risen to 50% above the average developed country. Families have benefited greatly from this. During that same period, the growth rate of family disposable income increased almost fourfold. So, how did that happen?
I'm here at Hevding, which started in 2005, and is a great example of the innovation that's coming out of Sweden right now. And in a minute, you'll understand what this is and why I'm also a personal fan of Hevding.
This is it. This is it.
So this is the first airbag for cyclists in the world. It's a revolution. And what it does is you wear it like a collar around your neck. And then there's a small computer. And if this small computer detects that you have a body movement that is close to or similar with one of the accidents stored in the computer, it will inflate in 0.1 seconds.
The point is not just for people like me who are a bit vain and want to protect our hair.
No, exactly. And it actually measures your body movements 200 times every second. And with this one, you're up to 8 times better protected than with the traditional helmets, actually.
So here are the fundamentals of Hävding.
Yeah?
It's a collar, and you wear around your neck like this. You zip it up. Then, of course, you have to activate it.
Yeah.
And it's driven on battery. So when I start this, in 20 seconds, it will inflate like it would be in an accident.
Right.
Okay. So
That's exciting.
Here we go. And when I start, it's going to take you 20 seconds before it inflates.
Right.
So have fun.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is exciting. So it could happen at any moment now. Is that it?
It
I
will
hear
start
beeping sound.
yes, when it counts
Is
down.
it late to change my mind now? I guess it was.
So now you can feel it really hard around your neck, which is great for whiplash injuries. And the amount of protection you have all around your head is
really stuck.
second to none. Yeah, you're really stuck.
So this is the way to ruin my haircut with your helmet as well. In recent years, Sweden's strong culture of entrepreneurship has led to increased innovation, more jobs, and the ability to weather financial downturns. But there are still hurdles. Tell me about regulation, because it is currently blocking you from selling to certain places, right?
The Consumer Protection Act in North America requires a physical product on your head with a chin buckle underneath. And of course, this product cannot do that.
So basically, regulation says that you have to keep on producing the same products that we've always used, and innovative products, it's more difficult to get.
Of course, this is the first in the world, so we're challenging the whole system.
But Swedish regulation does not block you in any way.
No, they don't.
If you take a look at Sweden, you have loads of people inventing new stuff and realizing what's needed in the market, and maybe before the market even realizes that they need it. And I think you can go build a company, you can go try your ideas.
You know, I'm brought up in the kind of Sweden where it was a bit frowned upon being an entrepreneur in business and so on. But it's changing, right? Do you have the sense that Sweden is becoming a better place to do business and be entrepreneurial in?
Definitely.
No doubt, no doubt. And definitely the climate for entrepreneurs and innovation is better than ever before.
So here we go.
Yeah, good luck.
Good
Thank
luck.
you.
Yeah, worked well.
Ska vi ta
I look like a Pokemon. All right.
We reformed our tax system and adopted a hands-off approach to free enterprise. But we didn't really cut back on the many welfare programs that had been put into place. Today, our taxes pay for pensions. You call it Social Security. For 18-month paid parental leave, government-paid childcare for working families, government-paid schooling through college, government-paid health care for all citizens, government-paid elderly care and nursing homes. But having the government manage all of these things didn't work well, so we had to manage it in another way.
We have some very interesting reforms on letting private enterprises into welfare, schools, hospitals, healthcare, elderly care, that have worked out quite well and added a lot of innovation and qualities.
It's a universal healthcare system, so everyone living in Sweden has a right to use the system. But there is a much larger part of the actual production of healthcare, which is made by private companies.
Another unique characteristic of Sweden's healthcare system is that it is primarily not run by the national government. Rather, the majority of healthcare decisions and the taxes to pay for them are determined on the local level. Private insurance is also available for those who wish for more options and to avoid longer wait times.
The way that social services are delivered had changed a lot. Whereas before, everything that was paid by taxpayers' money was also produced directly by the state. Now, in many sectors, private companies are the service providers, and this is particularly true for the school system.
In 1992, Sweden switched to a school voucher system, which allows all parents to make the decision of which school is best for their child. There are both public and private schools, and the vast majority all charge the same tuition. Each child is provided with a tuition voucher from the government that can be used in any school in the country. Today, 50% of Swedish high schools are private.
This is where I went to school as a teenager. It's been a while, and since then, the public school I went to has been transformed into this private school, the International English School. It's a highly regarded school, but the thing is, any parent in Sweden can send his child to this school by using a government voucher that gives them access to any school in the country.
Can I have 2 straight, quiet lines, please?
So this is 4th grade now. It actually used to be the cafeteria, where we had meatballs all the time. I love what they've done to the place.
Okay, this is how I started out when I arrived in this school.
Yeah.
But then I moved on. and on.
Oh, what? No,
This
you
is all
can't
you
be
really have.
serious.
Yeah.
This is late 1980s.
Wow, no. Why? Why did you go through this? Wasn't it like almost painful?
Might be the only time I saw my father cry. Is it important that every family gets to choose?
I remember that I were in my other school, which was on the other side of the bridge. I went to this test day on Saturday, and I just liked it. So
Yeah.
so when I came home, I said, I'm gonna start there. And here I am.
It's like a door to the future, almost. Like it opens a new door than if I would have gone to like an ordinary school.
Being able to choose for yourself is important because it's your life, and if you're not mature enough to decide yourself, then your parents should have the opportunity to choose for you.
The wealthy have always had school choice. If you have enough money to buy a house wherever you want to live, you can just move to somewhere where there are good schools. These are not options that are open for the poor kids.
The fact that you are allowed to choose school for your children, is that important to you?
It was, yes. It was, yes. And it has become much more important to me today since I have a son that is a little bit more challenged in school.
Some argue that making a profit off of education or healthcare is improper and will cause private companies to cut back on quality.
I think this feeling that the only way to make a profit would be to lower the quality, which of course in the rest of our world we tend to think it's opposite. That the biggest risk for low quality is when you can't make ends meet.
Once you have introduced a system where parents can send their kids to any school they want, in any neighborhood, in a different city, is that it's extremely difficult to roll such a reform back.
We have a waiting list. And to get on that waiting list, parents register very early. In some cases, when the child is 1 or 2 years old. And we go only according to the date of registration. There are no preferences due to how important you may be or due to how rich you may be. Yes, we are making money, and due to that, we have been able to expand to 34 different schools throughout Sweden.
In the past, the schools were very segregated. Now, these schools are open for every child. So you have more mobility. It is not costing any more in terms of taxes. So what's the problem?
There's been a lot of conversation in the United States about alternative models in schools and so on. But there are a lot of very strong special interests that have opposed school choice, for example, in the US. A part of this national conversation that Sweden had was to say, okay, we will provide state funding to make sure everyone gets an education, but it doesn't follow that the government is the best provider, that we shall assign students to where they have to go. And so they have voucherization in hospitals and schools and so many other areas where the government gives you the money and you can go and spend it the way that you want. So the market is delivering the service. And that's a very valuable lesson to see how to do this more effectively.
Is it the same truck every day?
Yeah, it's the same truck every day.
So you never walk out?
I'm here at Ragn-Sells, a Swedish waste management firm. And this is Johan Bergebäck, who's going to talk with me about working in Sweden.
This is an impressive bit of machinery.
Yeah, it is, actually. It's a lot of different...
Johan collects grease and food waste from restaurants in Stockholm. That waste gets converted to biofuel. As you'll see, this job has a unique odor to it.
Let's go there.
Yeah. For how long have you been doing this?
Since 2011. And I really enjoy it, actually. You can manage your own day, and I have a really good relation with my boss also, so that helps a lot. So.
Are you sure I should open it?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is part of the work.
Here we go. And we haven't really started.
No, we haven't started yet. This is just the first little sip.
Swedish unions are powerful. But the union's relationship with employers is not as adversarial as it sometimes is in the United States. Swedish culture has always favored consensus, and the unions and employers historically have a long history of cooperation.
The 70s and the 80s are a time of confrontation. The consensus culture collapsed. You have very big strikes too, so you have a totally different situation.
The extreme experience of the 1970s and 80s strained the relations between unions and employers. But since that time, both have worked to return to a more balanced appreciation of employee needs while ensuring business success.
Unlike many other European countries, Sweden decided to try to get an orderly way of organizing the conflict between companies and labor. It was decided that issues between business and labor should not be handled by the government.
What you do want to do is to support employers and the trade unions to make their own agreements and find ways of regulating things by themselves.
And for most countries like the US have minimum wage laws, for example. We don't have that in Sweden. Although Sweden doesn't have minimum wage laws, there aren't that many people with very low wages.
Many unions around the world think that technological change is a problem, while in Sweden it's something that we have been embracing for a long time.
One area of conflict that remains an issue is the union regulation that if a company needs to fire someone, it has to be the last person hired.
Old people who have had a job for a long time, they can feel pretty safe. Youngsters and newly arrived immigrants will have a harder time finding a job. And for the firms, in the worst case, the one you hired last is really, really important. It might be a programmer that is essential for your business. And that might actually punish your entire company.
But it seems like there's, at least if you compare it to some other countries, like it's more harmonious relationships between the company and the employees.
Yeah, I would say
it's
so.
not really antagonistic, right?
No, I know what you mean. I don't see any enemy stuff going on between the union and the workplace at all, actually.
Until I met the Americans or European labor unions, I felt that we had rather cumbersome and horrible labor unions. And then I met all the others and realized that we have a very cooperative, reasonable, pragmatic set of labor unions. I was over at a meeting in the US where I met both US employers and labor unions at the same time. And I was quite astounded. There was such a harsh atmosphere. And one of the Americans said to his Swedish counterpart that, well, you know, we need to have the respect that you get in Sweden. And the Swedish guy said, well, then you need to earn it.
For me, it's really, really important to work alongside and not against, you know. I'm going to spend a lot of my wake hours in this truck, and I want to be feeling good about it.
Okay, so this is not really the same thing as we did before.
No, this
right?
is a different pickup point. You have to pull up this lid the other way around. Yeah, that way. And then you...
Gosh, I did it.
I didn't think you would be able to do it, actually, but you're stronger than you. Yeah.
So high degrees of social trust allows a welfare state to persist for a very long time because people don't cheat. They don't cheat on taxes and they don't cheat on benefits. However, over the long term, institutions can erode those levels of social trust. So the World Values Survey asks a question about getting government benefits for which you are not qualified. In the most recent survey, only 55% of Swedes said you shouldn't apply for those benefits. 80% to 55%. So there's a greater willingness to game the system over time.
Yeah, we learned that the hard way in Sweden when we had the most generous government sick leave benefits. It suddenly happened that the, objectively speaking, most healthy population on the planet were off sick from work more than any other population on the planet. In 1988, workers claimed sick leave 1 out of every 8 workdays. But since the reforms, sick leave has gone down.
This is also a lesson for the United States. Long-term permanent disability qualification has been rising as the society becomes healthier. Why are more and more people qualifying for permanent disability? It's because of the erosion of this sense that you shouldn't do that.
Another area where Sweden is doing some unique things is with our pension system. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk to some retirees about what they think about the system. And what better place to have such a conversation than in a bastu, or as you call it, sauna. Winter or summer, we Swedes love a good sauna. Hey, I'm Johan. Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Hey,
Hey, thanks for doing this. So, what's the best thing about taking a sauna?
If you have sauna for 3-4 days a week, you live longer for 5 years.
There was a realization that the government pension system was not sustainable, and it was quite remarkable because there was a broad consensus. Almost all the political parties in Sweden agreed to make a reform.
Now, the bulk of pensions is really contribution defined. i.e. it depends on how the economy works and how much of your own savings you have put into the system.
So if things are going well for Sweden, pensions are increasing. But if things are going less well, pensions are automatically lowered without any political decisions having to be made. This happens automatically. There are actually equations in the law.
What do you feel about the changes in the pension system? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I believe it's quite a natural evolution in the society.
It became worse. They got less money. And I mean, for the young people, they are more dependent on saving by themselves.
I actually see this as one of the big triumphs of democracy in Sweden, that you could agree on a system like that, which basically takes away from politicians the ability to buy votes by just promising higher pensions and letting future generations pay.
I have a good life. And my son, he said, you are a good father. You have enough money.
It seems like ever since the 1980s, Sweden has been trying to find a new balance between the welfare state and the open market and more limited government. Do you think we're finding that balance now?
There are still long-term problems. Sweden is not utopia. Just to be frank, I think Sweden has had a more adult conversation that has taken place in the United States, where parties on the right or the left have gotten together and actually discussed what is affordable, what is feasible, what will last. I'm afraid to say this has not been taking place in the United States. The political discussion is so polarized, it's difficult to get Democrats, Republicans around the table to have a grown-up conversation about arithmetic. Sweden has had that conversation, and so they have moved towards systems that are actually sustainable.
Low-income earners in Sweden pay a lot more than low-income earners in America. So despite the fact that Sweden looks like sort of a socialist country which taxes the rich exorbitantly high, the truth is the opposite.
Sweden also has a very high value-added tax. It's much higher than any sales tax in the United States. So those are taxes that are really substantially borne by the working classes and poor people in Sweden. If the United States were to try to adopt really the Swedish model, it would mean imposing really high taxes on poor people and working class people.
The success of Nordic countries is not because of big government. It is not. The story is free markets really work, and Americans need to understand this.
Wages come from companies that make a profit. If we go on strike, there will be no money coming from the company, no wages. And I think that's a basic idea for trade unions in Sweden today.
Our population is still quite positive towards free trade, towards globalization. You need to convince every new generation and explain, because it's not always intuitive why a free market economy is the best. So you can never give up.
The biggest lesson that Sweden has shown is people who want to redistribute a cake have to make sure someone baked it in the first place. If no one bakes the cake, you can't redistribute it. Sweden has a very productive private market economy.
Sweden is where I was born and where I'm raising my own family. And today we're here at the Vasa, the world's only intact 17th century ship, and one of our favorite places here in Stockholm. Spännande.
Ja, kolla här. De börjar rulla på en. Den ska egentligen hålla ett svärd.
So Sweden is not the idealistic socialist state many Americans think it is. We do provide more government benefits for our citizens than the US does, but those benefits are paid for by everyone in the country, not just the top tier of taxpayers. Further, many of those benefits are provided by private companies competing with one another. Sweden is not perfect. There are still many changes I would like to see. But the one thing our country has learned is that without economic growth, there is no wealth to share. Then everyone suffers, the poor most of all. We have learned from our history. I would like to believe that Chydenius would be proud. Thank you for letting me share my home with you. Nej, inte särskilt. Kanske något fel. Gets more difficult all the time for some reason. Does it look natural or? It looks pretty good, but I'd like a second opinion.
Okay.
What do you think? This is a very complicated thing. This is a whole song.
All right.
I think I should.
Well, the bottom line is productivity. Productivity. Boy, you can't say that too many times. You've got to have those incentives in place, that the environment in place to tap those incentives. That's how you go from poor to rich. And Sweden's done it twice now. They went from poor to rich, back to poor, back to a very wealthy country. Okay, well, we've got this last section of the financial system. And this part's some of it's a little tedious, okay? A little more so than the last little bit. Probably the most since chapter 3 on trade. Now, it's not difficult, it's just tedious. Now, know the difference. And know the difference between something that's difficult and something that you might not get the first second you see it. Okay, so anyway, let's get going on that. Let's wrap that up, and that'll be chapter 26. Here we go.
Now that we've covered the basics of financial markets, risk and return, the economic purpose of financial markets, right, is to bring.
Well, here we go. This time for sure.
Now that we've covered the basics of financial markets, risk and return, the economic purpose of financial markets, right, is to bring savers and investors together. That's why they exist. We're now going to simplify all these markets. We talked about stocks and bonds and all kinds of different characteristics. We talked about treasury bonds and municipal bonds. Okay, all that is going to be simplified into one market, and we're going to call it the loanable funds market. Loanable funds, that's it. Okay, but first, unfortunately, we got to look at some identities. Remember the circular flow model where GDP was equal to national income? We're going to call income Y. Okay, I is taken, it's investment. So I guess the next thing to an I is a Y. So Y is equal to national income. And as you recall, GDP is the value of all final goods and services. And the income received from the production of those final goods and services is called just income. So GDP and income are equal. Now, to this point, we've mostly focused on GDP as, you know, in terms of spending. All that spending on the output flows through and becomes income somewhere. Thus, GDP and income are the same. Well, we're going to look at this as income now. And so, instead of saying GDP is equal to C plus I plus G, we're going to say income is equal to C plus I plus G. Now, notice I didn't put this, plus net exports. Well, we're going to simplify it just a little bit more. Just to keep it simple, it doesn't matter. The result's the same. We can illustrate the same thing without it. But we're just going to assume a closed economy. That means no exports and no imports. Okay. So income equals consumer spending, investment spending, government spending. All that spending equals GDP, which again equals national income. Well, now we're going to subtract C and G from both sides. Subtract it from that side. And I'm running out of room here, so I'm going to bring it down here. So all I did here was I subtracted C and G from both sides. Again, basic law of algebra. If you do it to one side, you got to do it to the other. And that equals, well, C minus C is 0. G minus G is 0. So all we have left on this right side is I. So what we have here, Y minus C minus G equals investment. Well, what do you call it when you have income and you subtract from it your spending? What is that called? Let's say you have $100 of income and you spend 90 of it. You've got 10 left. What do you call that 10? The part that you didn't spend. You call that saving. Sure enough, we've got income minus consumer spending minus government spending. What's left? Saving. So what we find here is that saving is equal to investment. And that makes a lot of sense. Think about it. How is there going to be any capital investment if there's no way to finance that capital investment? What is capital investment financed with? Savings. Capital investment certainly cannot exceed savings. So here we've got them, we show that saving is equal to investment. Okay, easy enough, right? Yeah, right. Easy enough. Not saying it's the most interesting thing in the world in economics, but you know, I thought that was pretty good. Okay. Now we're going to do something else. Let me go back and write savings as this, Y minus C minus G. Okay, that's savings. And, well, time out here. I'm going to need a little more room. Equal investment. Okay, that's just what we had up here. Okay. I just put it down here because now we're going to do something else. We're going to add 0 to both sides. Now, if I add 0 to both sides of the equation, I don't change the equation, right? 0 plus anything is whatever it was before. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add t, and I'm going to subtract t. And I can do it over here too. Add t, subtract t. But we already know that t plus minus t is 0. Whatever t is, doesn't even matter what t is. We know if we add it and then subtract it again, it's 0. So why are we doing that? Well, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to plug it in over here. By the way, t is taxes. So I'm going to say y minus c, and I'm going to bring this negative t, move it over here using the commutative law of addition, right? Everyone remembers that. I can move stuff around. I can put it in any order I want. See, that's the thing. I can put these in any order I want. It doesn't change anything. And then I'm going to, I think it's the associative law. These are going to associate together. I'm going to kind of put those in their little club there, their little group. And then I'm going to bring this positive t, and I'm going to put that in front of the g. And put the minus g over here. And then I'm going to have these associate together. And I only did that to the left side of the equation. Remember, we got that equals I over here. So since we know that savings equals investment, this is true, this is it, this is what we're doing, and all we did was we messed with this side of the equation. So here's investment over here. So what is all this? Just another way of saying savings. But we're going to split savings, obviously, in two parts. Here we've got income, and we're subtracting from that consumption, and we're subtracting from that taxes. So introducing taxes to the world, that is what we call private savings. Now, what is taxes to the government? Well, that's income to the government, right? That's cash inflow here. Government spending is cash outflow. So if you want to call taxes received by the government income, government spending, spending, income minus spending, that we would call public savings. And we add these together, private savings plus public savings, that equals total savings, and that is equal to investment. Now, this here, if this is a positive number, we say the government, well, let me write that. If that is positive, okay, let me print it. If that is a positive number, we say the government is running a surplus. If it's a negative number, meaning G is bigger than T, spending is bigger than tax revenue, That is a budget deficit. The government's running a deficit. They are spending more than they're bringing in. And where do they get the part that they're spending that they're not bringing in? Where do they get this excess? When they spend more than this? They borrow it. They go in and they issue treasury securities, treasury bonds, treasury notes, treasury bills. Now that we have private savings, public savings, total savings, and investment all figured out, all organized, now we're going to look at the loanable funds market, or the market for loanable funds. And guess what? We're going to draw supply and demand curves. Anytime there's a market involved, much of the time we draw those curves. Okay. The market for loanable funds. And over here on this axis, we're going to have the quantity of loanable funds. Okay, remember, that's loanable funds. And on this axis here, we're going to have the price of loanable funds. The price of loanable funds has another name called the interest rate. Now, for decision-making purposes, we're talking real interest rates. We make our decisions based on real interest rates, not nominal rates. Remember, real interest rates are inflation-adjusted rates. That's what's left over after inflation. So if your nominal rate is 5%, and inflation is 2%, your real gain on the amount of money you have if you're saving is 3%. That's a slight simplification. If you take a finance course, you got to introduce compounding in there if it's for more than one period. And so this is just a simplification as well, but that's okay. That's beyond this course. And it's not important to this course, more importantly. All right, let's talk about the demand for loanable funds. Who demands funds? Who needs the funds? Who needs other people's savings? Investors. There's the demand for loanable funds, just like anything else. Slopes down. When interest rates are high, those funds are expensive. It's expensive to borrow at high interest rates. So not a lot of borrowing going on. If there's not a lot of borrowing of funds going on, guess what? There's not a lot of capital investment going on either. And that's a problem. If interest rates are low, quantity demanded of loanable funds is higher. And why are they borrowing those funds? Why are they going to borrow those funds and pay money on them? Because they've got some capital projects in mind and they need the financing. They need the funds to pay for those expensive projects. Now, who supplies these loanable funds in the market? Where do they get them? Well, they get them from me and you, our savings. And that slopes up. Yes, at low interest rates, we're not interested in saving as much. We'd rather buy than save. However, at high rates, current consumption becomes kind of expensive because what are you giving up? You're giving up that high rate, real rate of return. So current consumption comes at a high cost of consumption in the next period. So high rates, yeah, we'll cut back on our spending and save a little more. So that's an upward sloping supply curve for loanable funds. And of course, we're going to put them together and we're going to have an equilibrium. Here's our equilibrium real interest rate. And here is our equilibrium quantity. And where the equilibrium is, we know that savings, modeled by the supply curve, is equal to investment, modeled by the demand curve. As we talked about in the last chapter on productivity, we talked about the basic characteristics needed really to get productivity, create the environment, what government can do to create the environment. All right? So we talked about, government that's not corrupt. Okay, we talked about property rights, well-defined property that can be enforced, a legal system where contracts can be entered into and enforced. Doesn't do much good to enter into them if they can never be enforced. Okay, so, and then we talked about, well, what if government wants to get out of the wagon and push a little bit? In other words, they want to move this equilibrium that way. That would be the goal. Move the equilibrium this way so there's more saving and investment. More saving, more investment, higher economic growth, more productivity, all that. Okay? So what can government do to, let's say, get out and push and move this equilibrium this direction? Well, before we do anything, let's look at what will do it with these curves. Well, the first thing that will do it will be to shift the supply curve to the right. See? Shifting the supply curve to the right will move the equilibrium quantity to the right. Also, shifting the demand curve to the right, or shifting it out there, will also move the equilibrium to the right. So the goal here would be to shift the supply curve to the right and or shift the demand curve to the right. So let's look at policies that would shift. Well, let's start with supply. What will shift the supply curve to the right? Well, let's draw another curve. Here's supply. We want it to go that way. So what we want is at any given interest rate, let's put in, here's 2, 3, 4, whatever interest rate. Here, let's say the interest rate is 2%. Here's how much I'm willing to save at 2%, right there. What would make me save more at 2%? Here I am at 3%. What would make me save more at 3%? What would make me or you or all of us save more at any given interest rate? Well, lower taxes on saving. That interest you get on your saving, let's have lower taxes on that interest, and that will motivate people to save more. And we've done exactly that. You ever heard of an individual retirement account or 401k or 403b, all these retirement accounts, right? 457. And then you've got the Roth. Boy, that's a super, well, we got Roth IRAs, Roth 401ks. The Roth accounts never, okay, well, the way these accounts work is they grow tax-free. You don't pay any taxes on them as they're getting bigger and bigger with interest and dividends and capital gains. But then when you withdraw the money, when you pull out the money when you retire. Then you start paying taxes on it. Okay. Nice thing about the Roth, okay, a little bit of a deviation here, is that once the money's in the Roth, it is never taxed. That's why they're so popular. Well, okay, so if you have lower taxes on the savings, that's going to shift the supply curve out to the right. Now let's talk about what will shift the demand curve for savings out to the right. Here's our demand curve for investment, or excuse me, demand curve for saving to be used for investment spending. That's a D. So let's say 2, 3, 4. What will make demanders of loanable funds borrow more? Here's what they're going to borrow at 2% right here. What will make them borrow more at 2%? What will make them borrow more at 3%? Okay, what will shift this whole curve out to the right? Well, you probably guessed it. If it's a government policy, one thing that they have, the lever they can pull, is they can make lower taxes. Lower taxes. Investment. So at 2%, before the lower taxes, they were willing to borrow and invest this much. But now with the lower taxes, see, that makes their after-tax return higher. That's what they really care about. That's what you really care about, is the part you get to keep after taxes. So if they get a tax deal where they get to keep more of their money, well, yeah, that's going to increase the demand, shift that demand curve out to the right. So examples are the investment tax credit. So in firms, when they invest in capital goods, they can put that on their tax returns and get a tax credit. That's when a tax credit, you can take it right off your tax liability. Whatever you owe on taxes, a tax credit just comes right off of that. So yeah, that would do it. Lower tax rates, accelerated depreciation. Accelerated depreciation would be another way to do it. On their books, if they've got a big, expensive capital asset, it's supposed to last many years. Let's say that it's supposed to last 10 years. Here's $1,000, but keep the numbers easy. $1,000 capital investment is supposed to last for 10 years, so every year they expense, that's an expense on their income statement, and the expense lowers their taxable income by $100 every year. But let's say they let them accelerate that depreciation. The true economic life of the good is 10 years. But for tax purposes, they'll let you depreciate it over 5. So they get to take $200 in expenses every year, and when they subtract those bigger expenses, that lowers their taxable income, lowers their taxes. Okay, so that'd be another way. Accelerated depreciation, we've got investment tax credit, and so those would be ways to stimulate demand for loanable funds and increase investment. That's the goal, to increase investment. Don't lose sight of the goal. Greater investment, greater economic growth, greater productivity, greater standard of living. So let's put that together. Let's put the curves together and see what happens. I'm going to throw a curve at you. What a guy. I warned you that I'm going to throw a curve at you, so it's not much of a curve. There's our equilibrium interest rate. There's our equilibrium quantity. Again, let's remember this is the loanable funds market. And let's say that the politicians decide that companies are not investing their money the way they would like, okay? It's not working out. They would rather tax those companies and government have control over how that money is spent. Okay, whether that's good policy or not is another matter. But let's look at the economic consequences. So which curve is affected? Well, we're talking about, let's say they do away with the investment tax credit, and that one actually that has come and gone several times. That is constantly coming and going, being added, being repealed, being modified. Let's say it's being repealed. No more investment tax credit. Well, investment tax credit, that's the firm. That means the firm is not getting to, their return on investment is not going to be as high. The firm, they're the demanders of loanable funds, so it's going to affect the demand curve. So once we've just determined what curve it's going to affect, now which way does it shift? Well, their returns on investment have gone down. Are they going to demand more loanable funds and invest more when their returns have gone down? No. Less. The demand curve will shift to the left. New equilibrium, ceteris paribus, all else equal. Real rate of interest will fall. And less saving, less investment, less economic growth, the whole bit. The equilibrium moves to the left. Now, let's suppose the same situation, well, no, different situation, whole different situation, kind of the same idea. It's determined that not everybody's saving that much. All these incentives to save. And the idea was to kind of help the common man, right? Well, the common man's out there blowing his money right? All too often. And only higher income people are taking advantage of these incentives. Well, let's get rid of that preferential tax treatment on savings. My goodness. It's being squandered. Okay, which curve are we talking about? We're talking about lowering the raising the taxes on saving. Well, the suppliers of saving, okay, the suppliers of the funds, it's going to affect the supply curve, and it's going to shift it to the left. People will save less. You know, they were saving what they were saving in part because of the after-tax benefits of the saving. But if you take away the tax benefits and you have to pay more taxes on your interest, well, you know, you're not going to save quite as much as you did before. So we got the supply curve shifting to the left. And we have a new equilibrium. Equilibrium rates go up. Equilibrium quantity falls. We got savings and investment, lower savings, therefore lower capital investment. You can't have more capital investment than there are savings available to finance it. So, lower economic growth. Okay. Well, one last little thing here. Also, what will affect the supply and demand? And this one's a little bit tricky. It's not as intuitive. So it depends whether or not the government runs a deficit or a surplus will affect, well, what will it affect? Which side of the curve was deficit and surplus? We're talking about this here. Surplus, deficit. We're talking about this. If if G is bigger than T, they're running a surplus. Just testing. If G is bigger than T, it's negative, they're running a deficit. So be careful. And what does this affect? The left side of the equation, savings. This will affect public savings, which means it's going to affect total savings, which means it's going to affect investment. So whether or not the government runs a deficit or a surplus affects the supply curve. It affects saving. Here, this side of the equation is the supply curve. This here is the demand curve. So we're talking about the supply. Okay. Let's say this is year 1, year 2, year 3. And this is T, this is G, T minus G, and this is deficit or surplus. Okay. Well, let's say in year 1, tax revenues are 100 and government spends 100. That is what we call a balanced budget. They brought in, they didn't spend any more than they brought in through taxation. Well, what happens to saving? There's private saving. There's public saving. And that equals total saving. And keep in mind that is all equal investment. So, we don't know what private saving is here. We're going to keep taxes the same. So it's not affecting private saving. Keep in mind that this number is this number. The expense here, the cash inflow here. So, public save, let's give it a number. You know what? Let's say private savings 20. And public savings is 0. So total savings equals 20. And therefore capital investment is going to equal 20. And so on our supply curve, supply and demand curves, 20. There we are. That's what that looks like. Okay, now, let's say in year 2, taxes is 100, and government has increased spending to 110. So 100 minus 110 is minus 10. Now they're running a deficit. what has happened to total savings and therefore capital investment? Well, this is now minus 10. Okay, this number comes from here. So 20 minus 10, and so total savings is now 10. So what is capital investment? It is 10. So in our graph, so what has happened to the supply curve? Again, we're talking supply. This is the supply over here, savings. This has gone down, so the equilibrium has moved this way. The reason it moved that way is because the supply shifted to the left. So if government runs a deficit, the supply curve shifts to the left. There's less. Okay, we can see that. See, it used to be 20. This used to be 20. It was here. Now it's over here. And the next year, same thing. They have run another deficit. Okay, that's going to shift the supply curve to the left. So, another term, deficit and debt. In year 2, they ran a $10 deficit. They had to go into the market and borrow 10 bucks. Year 3, they ran another budget deficit. They had to go into the markets and borrow 10 bucks. The debt after year 2 was $10. But after running another deficit of $10, yes, the deficit was 10, but the debt, the total debt, is now 10 plus 10. And if they keep running a deficit every year, the debt gets bigger. That's a common misunderstanding of the difference between deficit and debt. Some people think they're the same thing. A deficit is the yearly shortfall. The debt is the sum of all the previous year's deficits, plus the interest owed on that debt. Okay. Well, I think we did it. I think we got, yeah, well, here, important term here. In this case, when this happens, when government runs a deficit and therefore shifts the supply curve to the left like this, total savings falls, which means capital investment falls. So because of that deficit, because the government went in and borrowed that money's not available for firms for private investment. Therefore, we say that, in this case, public spending has crowded out private investment. Okay, the savings weren't there, so that's what crowding out is. It crowded out private investment because the government ran a deficit. And are we running deficits today? Oh boy, are we ever. Got sky-high debt. You know what? Interest rates are low. Federal Reserve Bank, we'll talk about all this later, just pumping out the money, just pumping it out, trying to stimulate the economy. Okay, more later about that. And yet, so it's there. Interest rates are low, but we'll find out later in the semester, inflation is a concern. It's not popped out yet, and for all you know what? The pandemic may have prevented inflation. Okay, we're looking for good, and it's hard to find any good, but it may have saved an inflationary spiral. Who knows? As the economy was roaring along before the pandemic, Pandemic shut it down. Maybe that inflation that we've been bracing for because of huge amounts of money supply, trying to stimulate. Well, we shall see. So not a lot of crowding out right now, even though deficits are high, but over the long term, okay, remember we're talking long term here. Yes, savings not available to the private sector has been crowded out if government runs a deficit. Okay, I think we did it. I think we just successfully completed chapter 26. All right. There I am again. Well, that gets us through to through chapter 26, I think. So we'll have that due next Thursday, and again, don't hesitate to ask any questions. I get to them pretty quickly. If you send a question in Blackboard messages, I'll see it sooner. Again, like I've said before, if you email me at my campus email address, you're one of 5 zillion emails I get every day. But and you know, you don't want to be that. So that'll do it. That'll do it for today. Remember, chapter productivity, what chapter 25 is due tonight, and then 26. And then the following Tuesday, November 3rd, we'll have our second exam on the last 4 chapters we've been doing. Again, I'll send that out in the course announcement. And that's it. Got a couple of minutes. Anything anybody want to chime in and say or ask or
Hey,
whatever?
Professor.
Sure.
Will the exam be laid out how it was for the first exam?
Pretty much. More or less. Probably more than less. Yeah, pretty much.
November 3rd, you said?
Oh, yeah, Tuesday the 3rd. That's what I'm thinking. We'll be starting on the next chapter, obviously next week, but that won't be on the exam. We'll cut the exam for just 23, 4, 5, and 6, and be those 4 chapters. But we will get started on the 20th, well, I guess it's 27. I don't think we skip a chapter here. And I don't even know what it is. So how's that? It's whatever the next chapter is. It might be the monetary system. But anyway, we'll get started on that. And I'll put that in there so you can see it. And we'll get going on that Tuesday. All right. See you then. Have a great day.
Bye. Have a good day.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye. Take care of yourselves.